All right, we're starting a new section here on cell communication or cell signaling. We're going to talk a little bit about the different types of cell signaling, how cells respond, and particularly the G protein and second messenger systems. There's a picture of algae here. They can coordinate their behavior. That requires cell signaling. Even simple cells can do this. Communication with cells generally requires a signaling molecule or ligand. The signaling molecule is released by the cell. Another cell, or sometimes even the same cell, has a receptor molecule to which the ligand binds. And that's the second thing. The interaction between these components initiates signal transduction. And then that signal transduction is the process of converting the signal into a cellular response. So let's go over some basic mechanisms here of, of cell-to-cell communication. Um, there are different types of signaling here. Signaling can be autocrine, where a cell signals itself by releasing a molecule and then picking that molecule back up. Cells can also signal across to cells that they are directly attached to. That's gap junctions. And then we have paracrine, which is nearby, and endocrine, which is distant. So let's look at these a little more specifically. Signaling across gap junctions. This happens in early development and in special organelles like a heart. Um, Molecules on the surface of one cell are recognized by the receptors of the other, or they're signaling across little bridges between the cells. And so you find this, uh, you know, very commonly in early embryos, but also sometimes in specialized organs. Paracrine signaling is signaling from nearby cells. So the ligand is released from cells and is going to interact with nearby cells. Again, important in early development, and it allows tissues that are nearby, clusters of nearby cells to coordinate their activity. We see this in like inflammation, which is a coordination of activity by immune cells. We also see this in cells that signal over short distances like nerve cells, where the nerve cell directly stimulates a cell that it's targeting. And so this is sometimes called synaptic signaling. This is really common in animals, not so much plants, but the neurotransmitter has a very short gap between it and the cell it signals. This is called a synapse. And so these cells are associated very closely. Okay, the final type of signaling is endocrine signaling, where the hormones travel a long distance. They usually go through body fluids and can affect cells throughout the body. And this occurs in both animals and plants. Uh, we'll talk about hormone molecules in one or two of the examples. Okay, another thing we can talk about are the different classes of membrane receptors. Many are chemically gated ion channels that open or perhaps close to change the movement of a specific ion. Okay, many neurotransmitters signal this way. Uh, Other receptors are linked to an enzyme, and the enzyme becomes active when the ligand binds the receptor. Usually, these enzymes are what are called protein kinases. They'll add a phosphate to another molecule. And then a third type, and it's really kind of a protein kinase, it's the G protein coupled receptor, a very specific kind of receptor where when the ligand binds, the G protein, uh, which has guanine triphosphate bound to it, starts to the signal transduction pathway. And so it's a specialized type of protein kinase. So here we have these shown in picture. So this one in the upper left is the receptor that opens an ion channel. So here's at the very left, it's closed. When the ligand binds, it opens. The upper right is an enzyme linked receptor, And so when the ligand binds, the receptor becomes active, usually adding a phosphate kinase. And then the bottom one is the G protein coupled receptor. And here this G protein is inside the cell. When the ligand binds on the right there, the G protein separates from the receptor and becomes active and is going to activate some other system, maybe an ion channel, maybe more enzymes. We can also classify receptors by their location. Receptors can be uh, membrane-bound receptors. Whoops, I went the wrong way. Membrane-bound receptors or intracellular receptors. Um, and so the intracellular receptor is in the cytoplasm. The membrane-bound receptor is on the cell surface, on the plasma membrane. It's a transmembrane protein in contact with both the outside of the environment and on the inside. Okay, so I've kind of talked already about uh, the cell surface receptor, but let me talk about the cytoplasm receptor inside the cell. These are the receptor is waiting, and the molecule must cross the plasma membrane so that it can bind to the receptor that's in the cytoplasm. Hormones like estrogen and testosterone can do this. When the hormone binds to the receptor, usually then an inhibitor is released, and very often these hormone receptor complexes will go to the nucleus and they'll turn on DNA transcription so that new proteins are made. So it's a change in gene expression. A good example of this are the steroid hormones used as performance enhancing drugs. They're often similar to testosterone. Their common lipid soluble structure allows them to cross the membrane receptor and bind to the testosterone receptor in the cytoplasm. Um, and then this is going to shift to the nucleus and activate gene expression. Why athletes like this is that this can turn on responses that normally aren't on. So uh, normally adults in their late 20s and 30s have a really difficult time adding a lot of muscle growth. But if you can turn on enough of these steroid receptors, you can put on lots of muscle growth when you're older. The downfall of this is that this also can lead to inappropriate cell growth, like in cancer. And so the guy at the bottom there was a football player, renowned for his strength and aggressiveness. He later admitted that he was taking lots of steroid drugs and then came down with cancer and ultimately passed away from it. So, with I did mention the cell surface receptors. Let's talk a little bit about signal transduction. This is when the ligand binds to the receptor. What goes on within the cell? Um, well, different cells can have different responses to the same signal because what's the same receptor on the cell surface can be linked to a different signal transduction pathway inside the cell. Usually these pathways are going to add phosphates. They involve protein kinases. Um, for lots of enzymes, changing whether they have a phosphate or whether the phosphate is removed changes their activity. So they can have like an on-off switch. And so protein kinases often turn them on, phosphatases often turn them off. And a cell signal then often revolves around this, adding or subtracting phosphates. So these signal transduction pathways usually involve protein kinases. The signal molecule activates the signal inside the cell, which involves one or more protein kinases that lead to a response protein. This shows that the chain of events, but it really looks more like this, like a pyramid scheme, where one kinase activates several kinases, which each will activate more kinases. And so you get this ever larger and larger response. And so this can cause massive changes in how cells respond. The largest group of these kind of receptors are the G protein coupled receptors. And the G protein acts to um, when it's turned on, it has an extra phosphate from guanine triphosphate, and it's going to usually activate enzymes. And so uh, these enzymes are often going to add phosphates. They include like this adenylate cyclase that's very active in second messenger systems. They can be others as well. A good example of a system where it uses G protein coupled receptors and you have this kind of activation of cells, it involved the hormone insulin. Insulin controls glucose metabolism. Probably most of us know it from the disease diabetes mellitus that produces thirst, hunger, and excessive urination. We first understood this in the previous millennium, and we realized that diabetics need insulin, and that this was a common endocrine disorder. And uh, the for most people, they can be treated by taking extra insulin. Either they're not having enough or not producing any, and if they take insulin, they can manage all their symptoms with this one molecule. And that's because insulin works at a whole bunch of different cells. It works at muscle cells, liver cells, it's working at cells of the intestine and all sorts of things. And so we can get back to normal blood sugar by affecting what goes on in the liver, in fat cells, in muscle cells, and all these organs are doing different things, but they all have the same receptor. It's just linked to different systems. So the insulin receptor is linked to protein kinases that will add phosphates um, to specific molecules. And so, like in liver cells, this will lead to a pathway that activates the enzymes that store glucose as glycogen. In muscle cells, this will lead to a pathway that will cause muscle cells to use glucose as a source of energy. In fat cells, it'll be linked to a pathway that causes them to take glucose and convert it to fat. Um, Another kind of thing I wanted to mention were that drugs of abuse, like opioids or nicotine, these are often working by triggering receptors. The big downside of these drugs is that by overstimulating the receptors, it leads to fewer receptors being produced. And so you can't get normal activity of the drug or of the receptor unless you take a lot of the drug. So people become dependent. They have to take more and more of the drug to get normal activity. So after a while, they're not even getting high. They need the drug so that they're not sick, so that they don't feel depressed or bored or uh, whatever. And so this leads to really big problems, higher and higher dosages, heavy and heavy withdrawal. And so this is true for opioids. And often people who are abusing opioids commit suicide because they feel so bad when they are not on the drug and they can no longer get high. We have similar issues with nicotine in that nicotine is slamming these receptors that help us feel calm. And so smokers need to smoke more and more and more to get the same feelings. And so they tolerate higher doses, they become dependent, and they exhibit withdrawal when they stop. So I'll stop there. We'll talk more about this next week.